question types, grammar and editing. How do you tell which is which? Take a look at these first 6 questions here on this sheet with the English stuff. You can see that most of them, or they all say, no change. Those are 6 grammar questions right there. How do you tell? They just give you 4 options. First one's always going to be no change, and then you have to pick the best one otherwise. So a few things. First of all, no change is a real answer on this test. About a quarter of the questions are going to be correct as written. So if something looks good, don't be afraid to answer it. It's not a trap, it's not a trick. The second thing is that they're looking for 3 things in your answers. They're looking for the grammatically correct answer, they're looking for the most relevant answer, and that just means the answer that doesn't change the meaning of the sentence, and they're looking for the most concise answer. And that's the little hidden trick to a lot of stuff on the English test. So I had a Burlington High School student about 3 years ago, really good writer, really bright guy, and had won some awards for like social sciences writing. And basically we'd worked mostly on math, and about a few weeks before the test he goes, "Can I do some English?" I'm like, "Sure, go ahead and do it." He scores a 19. That is not a very good score for a student who's as good at writing as this student was. Because, like I said, he'd won some awards. So I go, "All right, so you need the most grammatically correct, you need the most concise answer." And he goes, "Oh, no. I've always been picking the longest answer because it sounds the most eloquent to me." He goes from a 19 to a 26 on his very next test. To understand that, that's somewhere like a 40% improvement overnight. That's how important making sure you select the shortest grammatically correct answer is. They really are looking for writers that don't use excess words. If you can say it in 3 words and it's grammatically correct, say it in 3 words rather than 5 or 7 or 8. That helps you move through the answers most appropriately, because what you want to do, good news about the English timing is that most students really don't have much trouble with the timing on the English. But if you do have some trouble with the timing on English, what you want to make sure you're doing is you're working from the shortest answer choice to your longest answer choice. Because here's the deal. If you just go through each of the answer choices in order, looking for the one that's grammatically correct, well, let's say you read the second answer choice, it looks pretty good, but you're not sure about it, you still have to read the other ones just to make sure there's not a shorter one. If you start from the shortest answer choice, the first grammatically correct answer you hit, that's the correct answer. You're done. You can move right on to the next question. Now, you might want to read them just to feel more comfortable, but that's how important the shortness rule is on the English section of the ACT. What are they looking for in terms of grammar here? There's basically maybe 3 or 4 big issues that they look at. One is punctuation, and we're going to go over punctuation right now because there's only 5 marks of punctuation they test, and if you know what you're doing with these, your life will be much simpler. After that, verb tenses and agreements, and so that's how the dog walks versus the dogs walk. So if you hear that, you got one dog, it walks, there's an S on that. Multiple dogs, that's where the S is, there's no S on the verb. The dog just walked, or the dogs walk. There we go. So that's called the 1S rule, or I call it that at least, where basically if you have a singular noun, then the verb's going to have an S on it. If you got a plural noun, the noun wants the S, the verb isn't going to have it. That's the kind of verb stuff that they're testing in terms of subject verbs on this test. So after subject verb, you've got tenses, making sure that everything is either in the future tense, the present tense, or the past tense. And then finally after that, they're going to be testing pronouns and prepositions. So pronouns are things like who versus whom. Prepositions are, is this book by the author? Is this book for the author? Is this book of the author? Or is this book on the author? In a certain sense, those could all be correct. You have to figure out which of those is correct in context. So those are the big grammar areas that they want you to study. Let's go over the 5 marks of punctuation that they are looking for. So this over here is the apostrophe. Okay, apostrophe right there. Now, there's basically just 2 things we use the apostrophe for in English. Possessives and contractions. The dog, apostrophe S, bowl, the dog's bowl. Or we would say something, I won't go to the movies. Now, the good news is that I suspect because you're Vermont students, and Vermont students generally lead the country in terms of critical reading skills, that you probably get the idea of the contraction usage pretty well. I'm going to talk a little bit about the other rule, possessives, and the big two rules that get tested the most frequently on the ACT with apostrophes. So the first is, what do you do with an apostrophe when the word ends in S? So you have the dogs, bowls. On the ACT, if you have a word that ends in S, you just put an apostrophe after the S. You don't do S apostrophe S. So if you had the dogs, bowls, you would say DOGS apostrophe, and then you're done with it. You would never say the dogs, DOGS apostrophe, and then another S after. So this is what they're looking for. Can everybody see that there? Yeah. That's what they want. This here, this is the incorrect form. You don't want dogs ending in S and then another apostrophe and S. So that is the possessive apostrophe rule on the ACT in terms of how it works with S. The next one is the its rule. When do you use an apostrophe with its? So the confusion here is that the possessive is exactly the same as the contraction it is. So its bowl looks the same as it is, it's a nice day. So basically somebody had to decide, and I don't know who it was, is the contraction going to get the apostrophe or is the possessive going to get the apostrophe? And it was just decided the contraction gets the apostrophe. So if you can say it is, use the apostrophe. If you can't say it is in that sentence, then you can't use the apostrophe. The dog goes to its bowl. You couldn't say the dog goes to it is bowl there. So you can't use the apostrophe because it's not the contraction. There we go, kind of put that there. So if you're going to say it is, then you use the apostrophe. If you're going to say it's as in it belongs to it, then you don't use the apostrophe is basically the way that rule goes. After that, talking about the next piece of punctuation, we've got the semicolon, and the semicolon gets used two ways in English. It gets tested a lot the first way on this test. It gets tested almost never on this test either. So we'll talk about both of them, but really briefly, the semicolon is used for two things. It's to separate two complete sentences and turn them into one sentence, or it is used to separate a list of lists. So let me talk about that first one. So how do you know you've got a properly used semicolon? You can replace it with a period and it makes perfect sense. That's the test for a properly used semicolon. You can replace it with a period and it makes perfect sense. Otherwise, you think of the comma rule, we'll talk about that. You join two sentences with a coordinating conjunction. I went to the store, comma, and I bought some bread. I bought some bread's a complete sentence. You join them with the and. You don't have to do that with the semicolon. That's one of the more tricky issues on this test, is sometimes they will have, I went to the store, semicolon, and I bought some bread. That is acceptable with semicolons, but it's also acceptable if you don't have that and there. They're never going to put those head to head, but sometimes students get a little, scared when they see semicolon and I bought some bread. That's actually perfectly fine. So the other use of the semicolon, I'm just going to tell you so you know it for kind of trivia purposes. I've seen it on one test, so technically it can appear. But basically, the other use of the semicolon, list of lists. John bought bread, comma, milk, comma, and eggs, semicolon. Mary bought ice cream, comma, cones, comma, and whipped cream, semicolon. Mike bought pizza, comma, chips, comma, and salsa. So it's to separate a list of lists. Unless it's a proper noun, don't worry about capitalization after a semicolon. Okay, pretty straightforward. You got list going on, and you're joining them together. So you've got three lists or more lists. You put a semicolon between each of those lists. Very rarely tested. Now we've got the hyphen or the dash. So this is used pretty simply as well. Only two rules govern it. One dash means you're doing something surprising. Two dashes means you're adding additional information into a sentence. So one dash is something surprising. So here we are talking about the, oh look, there's an elephant. That would be, there would be a dash right before I said, oh look, there's an elephant, if this were an ACT question. So one dash is used to be surprising, something unexpected, or strong emphasis. Two dashes, you're just adding additional information in the middle of the sentence. So George Washington, dash, who lived at Mount Vernon, dash, was our first president of the United States. Yes.
Why couldn't that be a comma?
You could use a comma. In fact, there are 3 parentheticals in English. We'll talk about that in a second. But absolutely, you can use 2 hyphens, you can use 2 commas, or you can use 2 parentheses. They are interchangeable with each other. You can't mix and match them. And that they do test that a lot. When we rephrase that, what they test is they'll give you one dash, and then they'll add additional information in the middle of a sentence, and they won't give you the second dash. They'll ask you if you want to add that second dash. In that case, you have to say to yourself, is this something surprising? Is this like really changing the meaning of the sentence? Or is this just kind of additional information that's pretty standard? If it's pretty, standard information, 2 dashes are what you need. Remember, 1 dash is something surprising just happened, something unexpected. 2 dashes, you're adding additional information. Those are the 2 ways you use a dash. 1 dash is surprise, 2 dashes, additional information in the middle of a sentence. After that, you've got a full colon, and a full colon is only used one way in English. And here's what it is. You're adding additional information at the end of a sentence without which the sentence wouldn't make sense. So I'll give you an example of that. Only one person can save Gotham from the Joker, full colon, Batman. Exactly. Now, we wouldn't know who the one person was just from the beginning of the sentence. It's finally at the end we get what the sentence is talking about. That's when you're going to use a full colon. So when you see that they're trying to ask you about the full colon or adding additional information just at the end of a sentence, stop and say to yourself, do I know what this sentence is talking about if there's nothing coming after that colon? If you don't know what that sentence is really talking about or who that sentence is talking about, then yes, you need to use a colon at the end of that sentence to bring in that additional information. So then after that, we're going to talk about the comma, and then we'll move off a little bit from this. I'll just kind of give you a grab bag of some of the more common sorts of mistakes and issues. Commas get used 3 ways in English, very broadly speaking. If you've ever taken a formal grammar course, you know commas are a nightmare. There's like 50 different rules governing them. They basically break down into 3 categories, and here's what they are. The first rule is pretty straightforward. Joining 2 complete sentences together with a coordinating conjunction. I went to the movies, comma, and I saw the Avengers. Simple right there. We've got a comma and a coordinating conjunction going on right there. That's the first way you join that you use a comma. And how do you test it? You can put a period right where that comma is and get rid of that coordinating conjunction, and it all makes perfect sense. I went to the movies, period. I saw the Avengers. That's the first comma rule. Second comma rule is when you have a list. I bought milk, comma, bread, comma, and eggs. That's the second rule. The third rule is you're adding something to a sentence that you can get rid of and still have a complete sentence. So, for example, an introductory phrase. Having studied hard, I did well on the test. We can get, you would write that as, having studied hard, comma, I did well on the test. You can get rid of having studied hard. The sentence still makes sense, I did well on the test. So that's what the comma is there, to indicate that something is dependent, which means you can get rid of it and still have a sentence that makes perfect sense. Always use the serial or Oxford comma. So that was the list rule right there. I'll explain that. So when you have a list, what you do is you say, and this is actually really a good point to bring out because in Canada they don't use the Oxford or serial comma. So some of you being here near the border may have kind of used the Canadian version. So in American English, we say milk, comma, eggs, comma, and bread. We put a comma before the and, in other words. If you cross the border over into Canada, they don't put a comma before the and. So it's I bought milk, comma, bread, no comma there, and eggs. We put the comma there. There is a comma before the and in a list. So after that, that's basically it. I'm just going to kind of give you another example on the commas. Another way you can tell is, we talked about this a little earlier when we were talking about the dash and the hyphen. George Washington, comma, who lived at Mount Vernon, comma, was our first president. You can get rid of what's in between those commas. It's not necessary. So that's one way to tell, do I need both those commas? Yeah, because what's in between you can get rid of and you still have a complete sentence. George Washington was our first president. Perfectly fine, so you need those commas there. We can take a look at these questions right here. We take a look at question 1, just to go ahead and do some of these. So how do you approach question 1 here? Snowflakes form from tiny water droplets following a specific process of chemical bonding as they freeze. So what we have here is we're basically being tested on commas. So when you want to work through commas, you want to say, can I get rid of stuff? If you can get rid of stuff and still have a sentence that makes sense, then you need those commas there. If you can't get rid of it because it'll make your sentence sound like all garbagey and weird, then don't put the commas there. So snowflakes form from tiny water droplets. That sounds pretty good. Could we put a period at the end of that? Snowflakes form from tiny water droplets, period.
Yes.
Yes, we could. That makes sense. So in that case, what we have there is going to be correct, because could we get rid of everything after it then? Yeah, we could. If that's where our complete sentence is, snowflakes form from tiny water droplets, we're going to put a comma after that because we could get rid of what's afterwards, following a specific process of chemical bonding as they freeze. I want to actually move on a little bit. If you'll turn to the next page, I want to talk about the other type. So question 7, if the writer were to delete the underlined portion, adjusting the capitalization as needed, the sentence would primarily lose. This is an editing question, and that's how you know it. Notice how all those grammar questions we saw on the first page, they just went straight to no change and then 3 options. This is editing because it gives you that preface text. So when you've got an editing question, don't worry about the shortness rule. They're not testing you on commas or punctuation or subject-verb agreement. All the answer choices are correct here. What they're testing you on are really your critical reading skills now. So don't worry about length. Don't worry about commas. Think about, what is the author trying to do here? Because at the end of the day, what they're testing you on here is, sort of think of this. Imagine one of your classmates had to write an essay for a class, and they really want to do well on it, and they hand it to you and they say, how am I doing? Can you check this for me? Can you look at the commas and make sure they're all right? And can you tell me if things are going off topic? That's the sort of exercise you should have in your head for this, trying to help somebody with their essay. So when you get this and you see a question like, if you're going to lose something, what is it that the author's trying to say? The author's trying to explain how, I don't know, snowflakes freeze or something like this in this passage. So if you get rid of that, what don't you know about snowflakes? That's not a grammar question. That's really just thinking about what the author's trying to achieve there. So that's the big difference between grammar questions and editing questions. Grammar questions, they ask about this very technical stuff, and you have to figure out which one is the correct use of a comma or a verb or a pronoun. Editing questions, they've got that preface text. Don't worry about that technical stuff. Think about, what's the main idea here? What's the main idea of this passage? What's the main idea of this paragraph? What's coming before and after this particular underlined section?